In many cases, when you want to apply an adjustment to an image that will only affect a specific area, you might want to use a selection as the basis of that adjustment. Such is the case with this photo. You can see that the sky appears to be completely blown out with virtually no detail at all, but you can see it is fairly separated from the rest of the image, and so I think I'll be able to make a selection without too much difficulty, so I'll use that selection as the basis of my adjustment. I'll start off with the Quick Selection tool from the toolbox, and then I'll simply click and drag across the sky in order to create a selection of the sky. If I need to clean up that selection at all, I can certainly add to or subtract from the selection. For example, over here on the left side of the building, you can see that part of the building got selected, so I'll hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while I click and drag across that area in order to subtract it from the selection. You might also notice that I have a little bit of a building included in the selection down here, but to me that looks to be an area that is so bright, so blown out, that I'd like to apply the adjustment to that area as well as the sky, but not to the foreground building, of course. So this looks to be a pretty good selection. Note that the flagpole is included in the selection. I'm not going to worry about that because it's a relatively small area of the image, and frankly it looks a little bit bright, so it probably could use to be toned down a little bit. With the selection active, I'm now going to create an adjustment layer. In this case, I'll use curves to apply the adjustment, and so at the bottom of the Layers panel, I'll click on the Add Adjustment Layer button, and then from the pop-up menu, I'll choose Curves. This will add a Curves adjustment layer, as you might expect, but what's unique about this adjustment layer is that the layer mask that's been added by default is not entirely white. Instead, it's partly black and partly white, with white representing areas that had been selected and black representing areas that were not selected. What that means is that this adjustment layer, this curves adjustment layer, will affect the sky but not the building. And we can see that by applying a simple adjustment to the image. And notice as I adjust my curves adjustment that we start to see quite a bit more information in the sky than we ever might have expected. We can see a fair amount of clouds in the sky, for example, and those were really completely invisible before I applied this adjustment. I'll fine-tune the overall curve adjustment here. I don't want things to be too terribly dark, and in fact I think in this case what I really need is some contrast. So I'll scroll down a little bit here, and then I'll adjust the black and the white point in the photo. I'll hold the Alt or Option key, the Alt key on Windows or Option key on Macintosh, while I'm adjusting the white point so that I can get that clipping preview and make a determination of where I want to set that adjustment. And I'll do the same thing for the black point, holding the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while I drag that black point in so that I can see when I'm clipping detail. I'll back off that adjustment so that I don't get any real blacks in the image. I want to bring the adjustment just to the point where the first of those pixels start to appear. As a result of applying these basic adjustments to the white point and the black point, I now have overall contrast achieved in this area of the photo, and so I can simply drag the curve upward, now leaving the black and white points where they were, but simply darkening up the overall sky. So that's looking pretty good overall, but you can see some areas over on the left that are not looking all that great. I think I'll try a 50% effect in these areas just to tone down the overall result. I'll go ahead and choose the brush tool from the toolbox and then click on the foreground color to bring up the color picker, and I'll set the brightness value to 50%. That will give me a shade of gray so that when I paint on my layer mask, the result will be half the overall effect. I'll go ahead and paint in just these areas, and that looks like it will probably work out pretty well. I'll blend up into the top portion of the photo here, just painting in order to blend the effect so that I'm getting a nice smooth transition between the areas that I'm applying that 50% effect to as compared to the 100% effect for the rest of that sky. I'll also increase the size of my brush and paint a little bit more just to smooth out the transition between those areas. So taking a look at the layer mask, I'll hold the Alt key on Windows or Option key on Macintosh while clicking on the layer mask itself. You can see that I've painted certain areas with a shade of gray, and that will enable those areas to get half the effect. The sky is getting the full effect, and the building is getting none of the effect. So going back to the image and turning off the adjustment layer's visibility, you can see that I'm improving the overall result. I do think that I might tone down the effect just a little bit more. I'm going to press X to switch my foreground color to black, and I'm going to paint down here in the bottom of the layer mask, the bottom of the image. This area is already black in the layer mask. What I'm going to do is use that soft edge of the brush to paint with black, getting just a little bit closer to the area of that building at the corner, the distant building there. And so I'm just blending from black into a shade of gray, gradually adjusting the effect, gradually getting closer and closer so that I'm just using the soft edge of that brush in order to blend the overall effect. That's looking to be pretty good. The key thing to keep in mind is that when you want to use a selection as the basis of a targeted adjustment, in other words, using a selection as the basis of a layer mask for an adjustment layer, you may very well need to go back and apply some painting. You may also want to feather that layer mask. So with the mask active, I'll go ahead and increase the value for feather. I'll increase it by way too much, and you can start to see that the top of the building is getting a little bit of a darkening effect. And that's because I've softened the edge of that selection after the fact, effectively softening the layer mask. You don't want to soften the effect too much. Generally speaking, just a pixel or two will probably provide all the blending you need along the edge of the original selection. But as you can see, I've used a selection as the basis of a layer mask and then used the brush to paint onto that layer mask in order to fine-tune my results.